The further backward you can look, the further forward you are likely to see. Winston Churchill. Over the long course of recorded history, there have been three main types of political systems: tribal chiefs, authoritarian rulers, and more recently, democracy. Homo sapiens, rational man, appeared about 250,000 years ago. Like the other primates, the first humans depended upon the natural food supply of the land around them and lived in small social groups. As these groups increased in size, cooperated together, and invented simple tools like fire and spears, they became known as tribes. Out of this came the first formal political organization. Its leader was the tribal chief. The invention of agriculture is widely considered to be mankind's greatest invention because it separated him forever from all other animals and put him on a unique evolutionary path. The domestication of plants and animals was so efficient, compared to hunting and gathering, that it produced a food surplus and massive population growth. It also brought the dominance of the tribal chief system to an abrupt end. Remember that all through history there have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Always. Mahatma Gandhi. The defining feature of the authoritarian ruler period was the ruling class, headed by a king like Tutankhamun of ancient Egypt, a warlord like Genghis Khan, an emperor like Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, or a dictator like Julius Caesar of Rome. Authoritarianism is rule by the few for the benefit of the few. That requires a class-based society so everyone knows their place and does what they're told. Using ancient Egypt as an example, there were 8 classes, with slaves at the bottom and the pharaoh at the top. Today we no longer have slaves. We also no longer have scribes. That class is obsolete due to the invention of the printing press and universal literacy. This is the pyramid of power. The goal of the ruling class and its ruler was to stay in power and increase their power, with little regard for the lower classes. There were exceptions, like the Gupta monarchy during the Golden Age of India, but exceptions are rare. Under authoritarianism, the meek do not inherit the earth. It is the strongest who win in the perpetual struggle for survival of the fittest. Authoritarians are easily spotted because they share several key characteristics. The first is strict adherence to authority at the expense of individual liberty, which means follow my orders. The second is reliance on a constant stream of lies and propaganda. The third characteristic is creation of a constant stream of false enemies, so as to justify the need for the leader's absolute power and the sacrifice of everyone who's not a member of the ruling class. Authoritarians also continually stir up hate towards others, project strong leadership via harsh, iron-fisted, simplistic solutions, justify increased military might in war on the grounds that false enemies are harming us, and they detest a free press. Finally, they are intensely nationalistic and want to make their country great again. Every one of those traits applies to the worm-tongued kings, warlords, emperors, and dictators of the past. Those traits also apply to the slick-as-glass, smooth-tongued authoritarians of today. You can see these characteristics in 20th century leaders like Stalin, Hitler, and Mao Zedong. Turn the page to the 21st century and you see the same characteristics in Vladimir Putin, Recep Erdogan of Turkey, and Donald Trump. See those three men on the right? If you leave them in power long enough, they're going to do just as much damage as the three men on the left. That's how extreme authoritarianism works, and all of those leaders are extreme. This may come as a surprise, but from a system analysis point of view, none of these leaders are the real problem. None are inherently evil. Instead, they are symptoms of a deeper problem. Don't direct your frustration and change efforts at people like these. Direct it to the system that produced them. The third item on the list, false enemies, is the main strategy. If you can successfully create a thundering herd of false enemies in people's minds, then they desperately need you to lead them to safety.
The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, and hence clamors to be led to safety, by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. H.L. Mencken.
Hobgoblins are false enemies like Hitler's Jews and Trump's Muslims, Mexicans, and anybody who's not white. This particular strategy, the false enemy, has historically led to a lot of totally unnecessary suffering and death. Human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe. H.G. Wells. Ancient Athens was the birthplace of democracy, which is rule by the many for the good of all. Once democracy was fully established, Athens flourished. Quality of life rose to such a high level for such a long period of time that Athens gave us Socrates and his student Plato, and then Plato's student Aristotle. The work of these three giants of thought laid the foundations of Western philosophy, science, and even religion. In other words, the invention of democracy 2,500 years ago made modern civilization possible. After Athens fell to the Macedonians in 322 BC, the flame of democracy died out for 1,500 years. It was rekindled in 1215 when the barons of England forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. For the first time, the king's subjects had rights the king must respect. The Magna Carta didn't change the ruler. It changed the system. The barons and commoners now had rights that could not be ignored. A new seed had been planted. People have rights. The centuries went by. The seed grew. Homo sapiens, rational man, had used the power of reason to solve another problem. The seed sprang to life with the invention of modern democracy in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. How exactly were the people to rule themselves? That took another 12 years to figure out. the world's first fully defined democratic government, as defined by the Constitution of the United States of America, appeared in 1788. It was immediately followed by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in France in 1789. After that, there was no turning back because the system had been changed. We the people are now in control. The invention of modern democracy was such a beneficial leap forward that it swept the world. Today, 69% of the world's countries are democratic. Under democracy, the meek do inherit the earth. Activism as we know it was not possible before democracy because authoritarian leaders allowed no dissent. But a democracy is a nation of laws rather than a nation of men. In the long run, activists are civilization's greatest heroes. An activist is anyone who wants to change the world to help the common good. They might be a grassroots activist, a writer, a politician, a scientist, and really anyone just like you and me. On the shoulders of the world's activists rests the responsibility for solving the world's biggest social problems, all of which are forms of unnecessary suffering and injustice. Scientists engage in technical progress by solving technical problems, while activists engage in social progress by solving social problems. Peaceful activism could not exist until the invention of modern democracy, since before then, activists could not change the system without resorting to violence. But now they can. After 1788, like a racehorse that's just left the starting gate, the world's first modern activists burst forth and began solving huge social problems that had been impossible to solve before. The worst problem was slavery. In 1800, just as modern democracy was beginning to take hold in America and France, an estimated 3/4 of all people alive were held in some form of bondage, either slavery or serfdom. But today, after 200 years of the abolition movement blowing in the winds of change, slavery is illegal everywhere. In 1981, Mauritania became the last country to abolish slavery. But just because slavery is illegal doesn't mean a person has full equality. Full civil rights do not occur until a nation's laws guarantee equal opportunity for all, regardless of race, religion, sex, and other personal characteristics. In the 1950s and 60s, the ideal of civil rights swept the globe. Activists pushed forward everywhere, like in South Africa, where apartheid had kept 70% of the country locked in semi-slavery. The civil rights movement even spread to India, where 1/6 of the population were known as untouchables. And then there was the problem of colonialism. How can a nation be free if it's owned by another nation? Beginning mostly after World War II, courageous activists led nation after nation to independence, generally with violent revolution. But the struggles of India and its freedom was totally nonviolent. Mahatma Gandhi had read Henry David Thoreau's essay On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. Adapting this type of activism to India's unique situation, in 1947, Gandhi led the movement that freed India from 200 years of British rule without firing a single shot. In democracy, the only rights we have are those we give ourselves. So where do these rights come from? They come from the altruistic work of a long lineage of pioneering activists like Spartacus, Henry David Thoreau, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. All men are created equal, said the United States Declaration of Independence in 1776. But that was for men. What about women?
Ladies, let me tell you this. There will never be complete equality until women themselves help to make laws and elect lawmakers. Susan B. Anthony. Women have been trained to speak softly and carry a lipstick. Those days are over. Bella Abzug. I know nothing of man's rights or woman's rights. Human rights are all that I recognize. Sarah Moore Grimke.
The 2 centuries after modern democracy was invented were activism's finest hour. Working together in cooperation, millions of activists solved countless problems like these, either fully or partially. I cannot believe that the purpose of life is merely to be happy. I think the purpose of life is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate. I think it is above all to matter, to count, to stand for something, to have it make some difference that you lived at all. Leo Rosten. But there's a dark secret you seldom hear about, except in whispers. Yes, we solved some problems, but hidden behind that wave of initial success lies a larger group of problems that activism has been unable to solve. There's a clear pattern here. We've only been solving the easy problems. The unsolved ones are much more difficult. But there's more. The impact of the unsolved problems dwarfs the impact of the solved problems. The civil rights problem is about loss of rights, while the war problem is about loss of life. Some of the unsolved problems are so big, like nuclear war and climate change, that they could realistically cause Homo sapiens to go extinct. The graph illustrates the surge in the share of the vote for populist authoritarian parliamentary parties across 34 different OECD countries. Pippa Norris. It gets worse. A recent global survey asked this question: how do you feel about having a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Congress or elections? That's the same as asking, how do you feel about having a dictator? Here are the results. The trend is pretty clear. Authoritarianism is back in style. 67% of Russians prefer a dictator to a democratically elected leader. So do 56% of those in India, the world's largest democracy. And 34% of Americans prefer a dictator rather than a president. What this data tells us is that the world's biggest problem today is not climate change. It's the rise of hate-based authoritarianism, because that prevents solving the other problems. From this perspective, history is now running backwards from the democracy period to the authoritarian ruler period. Going backwards will make every unsolved problem on that list impossible to solve, because authoritarians don't want to solve common good problems. They only want money and power. Has modern activism really been born yet? I'm afraid I'm going to have to admit that the answer seems to be no. Activism is still in the dark ages, in pre-science. Something is missing. Something is holding activists back. We can solve some problems, but not others. The stakes are so high, it's like we're in the middle of a Greek tragedy. No matter what the characters do, no matter how hard they try to avoid their fate, they're doomed. It's a sinking ship. Why is the ship of civilization sinking? Where's the leak? What are we doing wrong? If we can answer that question, then we can stop the leak, turn the ship around, and run the pages of history forward again. Then we can make the progress that activists know is somehow possible. Democracy is no longer evolving forward, but is devolving backwards to authoritarianism. We have a deeper problem here. Democracy itself is in crisis. It's unable to solve important public interest problems, including the biggest one of them all, climate change. Back in 2008, Al Gore said the same thing.
I'm a big advocate of changing the light bulbs and buying hybrids, and Tipper and I have put 33 solar panels on our house and dug the geothermal wells and done all of that other stuff. But as important as it is to change the light bulbs, it's more important to change the laws. And when we change our behavior in our daily lives, we sometimes leave out the citizenship part and the democracy part. In order to be optimistic about this, we have to become incredibly active as citizens in our democracy. In order to solve the climate crisis, we have to solve the democracy crisis. And we have one.
So what can we do? How can we solve the democracy crisis? Al Gore is one of the most influential activists in the world.
10 years ago, when the movie An Inconvenient Truth came out, the single most criticized scene in that movie was an animated scene showing that the combination of sea level rise and storm surge would put the ocean water into the 9/11 memorial site, which was then under construction. And people said, that's ridiculous. What a terrible exaggeration.
There is a wake-up call here, and that is climate change and our vulnerability to it. It was true 10 years ago, it was true 5 years ago, it is undeniable today.
But speaking truth to power has not worked. Activists have tried that for decades. Telling people more about the truth of the severity of social problems just doesn't work on the unsolved problems. Why doesn't speaking truth to power work? If we can put a man on the moon and a rover on Mars, why are we unable to solve the climate change problem right here on planet Earth? Why is history running backwards? Why is modern activism not working?
Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
You know, we don't have state media in the United States, but if we had it, how would it be any different?
I think the media is really nihilistic. It's about making money. What makes money in this country happens to be avoiding difficult truths about our society.
Thousands and thousands of people were cheering as that building was coming down.
You have to get rid of this ignorant and meddlesome majority, control them, make sure they do the right things, all for their own good, incidentally.
Congresswoman, let me interrupt you just for a moment. We've got some breaking news out of Miami. Justin Bieber has been arrested on a number of charges.
Good journalism today has the state in its crosshairs, and you never want to punch down. You always want to punch up.
I would say our mission statement is to produce adversarial, fearless journalism. The more power someone wields, the more journalistic accountability and scrutiny they need.
There are policies that have been enacted. There are bombs that have been dropped, as a consequence of which these millions of people are destitute in the way that they are. And we have to allow them to tell that story.
There's only two types of reporters. There's those who care and those who don't. Most of them don't care.
We're being dumbed down, we're being watered down, and we're being told information which is false.
When the media acts as a conveyor belt for the lies, why it matters is because lies take lives.
Never believe anything until it's officially denied, said the great reporter Claude Cockburn. In other words, those whose job it is to keep the record straight ought to be the voice of people, not power.
In theory, the media has a deeply important function to play in a democracy. It's meant to direct a mass audience to engage with the greatest problems in society, so as to push politicians to make necessary changes. But as it is, the media is obsessed with scandals. It focuses relentlessly on the rather thrilling misdemeanors of a few people, rather than the large systemic failings that are harder to see and far less sexy to describe. It gives the population a feeling that it's on the side of the little guy against the big guy, but far from it. The sacrifice of the odd bigwig in a scandal and nothing, and reliably take our eyes off pushing for proper large-scale improvements. Most problems in society take time to fix, but by constantly changing the topic of national conversation, the media ensures that nothing will remain a priority for long. One always makes more money getting someone scared about bugs, viruses, explosions, than getting them to a sane, correct assessment of the dangers facing them and a melancholy acceptance of death and compromise in general. One makes more money getting people furious than patient before the challenges of righting a wrong, or philosophical in the face of human evil. It reports in impassive terms about adultery in a Hollywood marriage or the bad behaviour of a model. It pretends to care about so-called transgressions, while not admitting that it's at the same time titillating the audience, most of whom, deep in their unconscious, would love a chance to do what's being condemned on the surface. The media, therefore, hypocritically satisfies both our fantasies and our need to think ourselves normal and respectable. It's called the news because of an obsession with the notion that the new and important go together, but much that just happened is far less important than many things that occurred thousands of years ago. There are things we need that lie further back. The most significant bits of information could not always have happened in the last 24 hours, as the news pretends. When the media's in a serious mood, it will give us 6,000-word essays on global warming that only a handful of people read. It seems the choice is either between the sexy and banal or the serious and starchy. In the utopia, what we need is the most serious issues presented in the most engaging ways. It's not enough for serious journalists to plonk the important stories before us. They need to work doubly hard to get the story and then also to make it exciting as the latest from Taylor Swift. We like to think we've got a good media because it's free. Freedom is a wonderful privilege, no doubt, but on its own, it's nothing. We need a media that isn't just free, but also good, that is, able to direct a mass audience towards what truly counts, which is, as it's been since the days of Plato, justice, truth, and wisdom.
I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. It means greater attention to improved understanding of the news, as well as improved transmission. And it means, finally, that government at all levels must meet its obligation to provide you with the fullest possible information outside the narrowest limits of national security, and we intend to do it. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
Democracy is facing a crisis of trust.
This is a fraud on the American public.
And populations are increasingly polarized. So could the answer be to reboot an ancient idea?
We can change the nature of the relationship between citizens and politicians.
Citizens' assemblies are part of what is known as deliberative democracy. A group of around 100 people, picked at random but designed to be a cross-section of Scottish society. With the help of experts and facilitators, the group is tasked with discussing pressing issues and passing their recommendations on to the Scottish Government.
First of all, the conversation guidelines. So you will all have a copy of those brought to your table.
That's something to think about when thinking about how you can redesign and improve the Scottish tax system.
Members have met in person 4 times since 2019 and are now gathering online during the pandemic. So far, they've considered reform of drug laws and taxing wealth to create a greener economy.
We as a country want to try out a new way of doing politics, doing things differently through informed and respectful dialogue.
This kind of political engagement could be the key to reversing the decline of trust in politicians. Such gatherings could be an antidote to the increasingly polarised political climate. Many people feel they have little influence in the political process. Deliberative democracy could give voters an edge. Citizens' assemblies are nothing new. They're an ancient Greek idea coming back into vogue. Over the past 10 years, the OECD has recorded a notable increase in the number of deliberative processes among member countries and the EU. And there is evidence that this is succeeding in giving people more influence over policies made by politicians. Of 55 cases analysed by the OECD, 3/4 of public authorities implemented over half of the recommendations made by citizens. In just over a third of cases, they implemented all of them.
The issues that you will discuss over the coming months are beyond party politics.
One country is often cited as the poster child of this democratic innovation in politics. Ireland's widely acclaimed Citizens' Assembly on abortion legislation, formed in 2016, is considered to have helped its largely Catholic citizens find common ground on a highly polarising issue. After hearing from 25 experts and reviewing 300 submissions from members of the public and interest groups, 87% of people on the Assembly agreed Ireland's abortion laws were unfit. The government subsequently agreed to the recommendation of a national referendum. 2/3 of the electorate voted in favour of abortion rights.
This is a monumental day for women in Ireland.
Yet citizens' assemblies are not a silver bullet for troubled liberal democracies. Some processes have been criticised for not fairly representing the population at large. And the biggest challenge to more meaningful change in future remains the reluctance of politicians to embrace this model of democracy on a broader scale. Advocates say that unless politicians actually accept the idea of relinquishing some more powers, there is a risk of further public disenchantment.